All right. Hello. How is everybody? You're looking at the landing page of bulletproofpub.com and the first of 10 videos going through the Rise of the Expert series because this work is getting more and more pertinent with every day that passes. This work is aging well, unfortunately. So here's where you go on the landing page, under the table of contents, newest articles. Rise of the Expert series, those are the actual articles you can read for yourself. And then right below that, we did a podcast, Andy and I, from the Deep Share on each article. It's definitely worth watching. I've just decided to do one on my own here. So we're going to throw this on the history of propaganda, mainly so that we have high resolution work there. It's difficult to upload high definition video. I'm having difficulty, and if anybody can actually steer me towards the right place, I'd appreciate it. Because Y2K is the uploader I was using, and it's just messed up now. So if somebody can point me to a better uploader, it would help create a little better content here, better quality, which is key for us at Bulletproof, is having high quality, like this map we can see in the background. Those kinds of things you can zoom right in on. We don't take shortcuts. I think that's really what's helped us get to where we are, to expose the progressive era, to show that what's happening today with Elon Musk and the efficiency movement parallels exactly what happened 100 years ago. So I want to make sure that this is actually working. So yeah, okay, here we go. You guys should be looking at Brandeis Part 1, The Architect of the New Freedom. So when we initially started to write on Brandeis, because I'd already gone through the House of Truth, we'd talked about Walter Lippmann and gone deep into all of that, but we hadn't gone into Brandeis yet. And I thought I was going to be able to cover his life in one article. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that we were looking at an amazing historical figure, to the point where we have concluded with a straight face that he is the maker of our modern day social contract, the literal matrix. Okay, so I've included here on the initial introductory title some of the key terms that we're going to run into here. So the New Freedom is the 1912 campaign that Louis Brandeis is the architect of for Woodrow Wilson. The new competition is a term that he brought into the lexicon. He's very involved in the creation of the administrative state, regulated competition. This is at the time of breaking all of the trusts, okay, which didn't happen. This is one of the greatest frauds ever, right here. So Taylor Society. Brandeis coins the term scientific management. You can see it on the other side there, the principles of scientific management. This is where the efficiency movement comes from. Principles of Scientific Management, a book written by Frederick Winslow Taylor. This is why we see Taylor Society, because the whole movement was named after Taylor, not Brandeis. Even though Brandeis coined the term scientific management, Brandeis takes over that whole Taylor Society movement and directs them all. We'll get into that. Not today, but that's one of the chapters that had to be written, one of the articles that had to be separated out from his life and explained deeper. And really, each one of these could be a documentary in themselves. This man is an incredibly influential figure that nobody talks about, except for us. And we do believe that this is the era that is being gatekept. You want to talk limited hangouts, controlled opposition, gatekeepers. This is what is being kept. As unsexy as it is, and as dry and boring and black and white as it is, this is it. This is how you crack this code. This guy has direct connections back to Bohemia in Germany. It's Phi Beta Kappa Society, which we're going to get into. So for those that are even a little bit into the know, you can see where this actually goes. And it's direct connections, 0 degree of separation. Okay, so industrial democracy is a term that Fabian Society founder Sidney Webb, he wrote a book in 1902 or 1903 called Industrial Democracy, and this is really what our early 19th century societal model was built on, for sure. And still to this day, we look at Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, this large defense contracting community. This is where it was established through this idea of an industrial democracy. The democracy was going to first be built on the shop floor, and then it was going to take over the shop, and then all of the shops, and then across the nation, we would have democracy. So the old order changeth, and what is progress are 2 chapters from the New Freedom book. And we do somewhere along the way get into it. Okay, sociological jurisprudence is the new form of law, the new system of law that Brandeis introduces. He's the great practitioner. We get deep into this in Article 6, I think, the science of law. It's just so incredibly fascinating how they use law, because it's an underappreciated aspect here too, even though we all understand that we obey laws, and laws are, one of the more influential aspects of our behavior and human control. We don't really actually pay it that much attention. But they look at it as the most specialized form of social control. So of course they're there. And so we uncover how they infuse social science, these soft sciences, into law. And now today we argue largely on social science, social justice, and radicalism, more than we do argue a case on law or merits of law. Okay. And this guy has the Brandeis brief. This is what changes it all. It's called the Brandeis brief, but we'll get into that in due time. I just wanted to include some of those so we can give you a nice introduction. Okay. So here is a young Louis Brandeis, just after being born in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, in 1856, November 13th, to Adolph Brandeis and Frederica Dembitz. So the Brandeis is migrating from a small city on the river near Prague called Brandeis on the Elbe. We have some friends on Facebook doing some deep research on there, and we appreciate all of that. That's really great. So thank you. Lewis's family were followers of the radical Yakov Frank, or Jacob Frank, and Frankism, a sort of degenerate antinomianism or a rejection of all moral and social norms, a sort of redemption through sin. So we're starting to see a lot of people talk about this aspect, and I feel like this is really where they infuse this inversion of society. And Jacob Frank is considered a founder of the Illuminati. Okay. So the Brandeis family, part of a long rabbinical line of social reformers. Adolf himself, a liberal revolutionary who moved his young family to the States before Louis was born, narrowly escaping the fallout of the 1848 Austrian revolutions. Louis's great-grandfather, Aaron Beer Whale, and his brother Jonas Beer Whale were apparently the leaders of the Frankist movement in Prague. And their grandfather, Rabbi Aaron B. Weil, was the leader of Bohemian Jewry. So we see some very interesting connections. And a lot of that has been added since we did the deep share with Andy Rouse. So we're going even deeper, but we want you to understand that there's a connection here between those 3 families. Okay, so it was in 1848 that Adolf was chosen as a representative by the oldest members of the Brandeis, Dembitz, and Whale families to travel to North America as an envoy or scout to, quote, study American conditions and select a location, end quote. That's page 15, Brandeis, A Free Man's Life, from Alpheus Thomas Mason. He's a McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence Emeritus at Princeton University. And I have his book right here. 1946, first printing. You can get this kind of amazing thing still on the internet or through the mail in real life. You can get these physical books, and I'm encouraging everybody out there that is concerned with where we are right now to start collecting these books, because they can turn the internet off with a flick of a switch, right? So bulletproofpub.com, The History of Propaganda, and Diego Garcia and me, Dwayne Hayes. We value very much the physical first printings of things because they are the most trustworthy and dependable. We are in the mode of the historical model. We're going to collect artifacts, primary source material, like the introduction that I put out the other day that was highly censored because I used AC/DC. Okay, but that's what we are. We are using the historical method. And we are using deductive and objective logic to work our way through this. And we aren't being distracted by whatever is in the news today. We are getting to the bottom of things, okay? And we're having some pretty important successes here with people seeing our work, with important people seeing our work, making connections, changing their perspectives on things. And that's really what we need, because if we can really understand this progressive era, their whole game is over. So I'll try to keep the digressions to a minimum. But it's important for me to comment on this stuff as we go, because there are connections maybe that you don't necessarily see. I don't know. I'm going to just try to look at it through the eyes of somebody that's just being introduced to this thing, and I'm going to err on the side of explaining things deeper. So I appreciate everybody that's coming and looking and watching and paying interest here, paying attention here, rather than the mainstream. You need to get that needle out of your forearm. So Adolf arrived in New York, traveled for a while in the East, and then went on to the agricultural Middle West, visiting farms and villages along the way. Young Brandeis's pleasure and facility in travel were greatly enhanced by the companionship of a young friend of the whiles, then on a business trip to the United States to secure information about American investments for the House of Rothschild. Free man's life. Rothschild riding shotgun with the Brandeises before Lewis was born, on their carriage heading out west to study American conditions and select a location. They land in Cincinnati. They head west again, fail, and then come back to where? Cincinnati. Interesting. So this all amounting to a strange chapter in the biography of an eventual member of the U.S. Supreme Court, an advisor to the U.S. president. And despite many efforts to suppress his upbringing, it remains after all these years still true. And the present day narrative surrounding Brandeis remains largely apologetic, if not completely dismissive, of his many obvious and concerning conflicts of both interest and character. So we aren't even 5 or 6 paragraphs in, and I hope I've captured your attention, because this is what everything after is based on. Right? This is like looking through a kaleidoscope, trying to find reality through a kaleidoscope. It's been already hijacked by antinomianism, the rejection of all morals and ethics, and he's a U.S. Supreme Court justice. This is why it was the longest contended nomination. Not to mention that he was already the leader of Zionism. Spoiler alert. So Brandeis's, quote, Brandeis's grandfather and great-grandfather in Prague had been leaders in the Frankish cult that swept Central Europe in the late 18th century. That's from page 28, Arthur S. Link, Woodrow Wilson and the Progressive Era. Woodrow Wilson in the Progressive Era, Arthur S. Link. That's a second printing. But I got another copy. It's an Easton Press. You ever seen these? Just to show you we don't screw around. The last thing we do is screw around. Can we get this on screen somehow? There we go. We do this for you guys, you know. I think I'm doing this for my own pleasure. When's the last time I skied? So, quote, he, Jacob Frank, slept with his followers and maybe even his daughter. He preached a nihilistic doctrine that saw this world as intrinsically corrupt and believed that the best way to imitate God was to cross every boundary, transgress every taboo, and mix the sacred with the profane, end quote. Okay, now that's not me saying it. That's Rabbi J. Michelson, PhD in Jewish Thought, Hebrew University. He's got a jurisprudence degree at Yale. He's an assistant professor at Chicago Theological Seminary, so he understands religion. He's a visiting scholar at the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion and contributor to CNN, MSNBC, and Meet the Press. So why I'm saying that is because he's a total mainstreamer. It's not like this is conspiracy theory, okay? And so whenever possible, I'm going to use a primary source material, secondary source material. Like I said in the intro, we're using sources from Ivy League universities and legitimate, reputable professors. A lot of them professor emerituses with tenure and all kinds of respect. So don't come at me. Go at Rabbi J. Michelson. Actually, go and find him on YouTube because he goes deeper into the Frankism. I strongly encourage you to go search out J. Michelson. He's on YouTube talking about the same things that people got banned from YouTube for and are saying now on Rumble and Odyssey. But because he has these credentials, and this is why I approach this work this way, because he has the credentials, he's considered a professor emeritus doing a lecture. Whereas I could be considered a conspiracy theorist spreading misinformation for this very same stuff. So just depends on what context you're showing all of this stuff in. I'm showing this in a far more negative light than Rabbi J. Michelson is, I assure you. And he'll have a limit to what he says, and he becomes an apologetic, you'll see. So, quote, Louis Brandeis had a portrait of Frank's daughter, Eva, on his desk at the Supreme Court, an heirloom he received from his Dembitz relatives, whose ancestors were followers of Frank, end quote. There's two sources there, and then this following here, it's my mistake on the text. It should just be black, because this is my words. But Brandeis eventually marrying Alice Goldmark, his second cousin, and daughter of the prominent Austrian chemist, the discoverer of red phosphorus, Joseph Goldmark. He's got 7 daughters. Brandeis marries one of them. So young Louis entered Harvard Law School in the fall of 1875, walking the hallowed halls of Harvard just shy of his 19th birthday, graduating in 1877, class valedictorian, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa Society at the age of 20. Brandeis recorded the highest grade scores in the history of Harvard Law School, setting an academic standard that stood for 80 years, and that was Brandeis' entire life. Okay, so one thing I'm going to say here too. If anybody's familiar with, in baseball, they call, some of the best players 5-tool stars. It means that they can hit for power and average. They got good speed. They can steal a base. They got a good glove. They can catch, and they can throw you out at home from center field because they got a good arm. That's a 5-tool star. So I say that Brandeis is a 5-tool star, and many of these guys I call 5-tool stars when they hit all 5 of these criteria, that they come from an Ivy League university, they're Jewish, they're Phi Beta Kappa, top of class, and with a Master of Arts degree. These are the most intelligent tools of the trade that you're going to find. We talked about tools of the trade in yesterday's show. For those following along, we're going to start now going back and forth and showing you that this is who they are looking for. So our entire K through 12 education system is a filter system to find out, to identify exactly who they want. It's not necessarily the smartest people, but the most utilitarian for their purposes, right? This is the useful tool, the useful idiots. Yet these ones, especially Brandeis, they are not idiots. And I would consider Brandeis a high-level grand strategist. So as we begin our investigation into the rise of the scientific expert, we repeatedly stumbled into the life of Louis Dembitz Brandeis. It wasn't long before we witnessed emerging from the dust-covered pages a figure of monumental historical importance. From his earliest work at Harvard as the very first law clerk to his founding of the Harvard Law Review and his career as the people's attorney, to becoming architect of the presidential campaign platforms and a founder of the administrative state, Brandeis became a personification of the rise of the expert. Brandeis is undeserving of his present-day place in near pitch-black obscurity. Herein we submit our report on Justice Brandeis and ask, firstly, how a man with such a radical degenerate family background, such as Frankism, could be even considered for a seat reserved for only those with the most impeccable of moral and ethical standards, right? How does a U.S. Supreme Court justice that has a background in antinomianism and the rejection of all moral and ethical laws get elected to one of the highest chairs in America? So there's a little public service announcement similar to our intro there. I don't need to read. There's the Phi Beta Kappa Society. And here's Brandeis circled, class of 1877. Now, he was already famous within his class, being the class valedictorian, Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude, right? And there are legends about him there of how students would misplace their books and they would go ask Brandeis, and Brandeis would tell them, oh, it's on top of the heater in English class. And they would go, and sure shit, the book was there. These are legends, myths, possibly, but there is no doubt that he is class valedictorian, Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude. There is no better way to leave Harvard than with a Master of Arts degree, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, Master of Arts, like from Harvard Law, right? It'd be super powerful. And his law partner that he first goes out with, he's second in class. So you can imagine the power that they had and the influence that they would have had knowing such things. Let's get this straight here. So he, meaning Brandeis, was the forerunner of other social activist lawyers who were later appointed to the court, such as Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Academic historians even today are forced to admit Brandeis was a pioneering, radical, social reforming justice who outlasted a highly contentious nomination to the Supreme Court. From late January to early June of 1916, Brandeis's nomination was rightly contested more than any other in American history. By 1916, Brandeis's many conflicting political interests were seen by Americans as problematic for such a hallowed seat. Brandeis, largely deemed by public opinion unfit for public office, yet once confirmed, he sat on the U.S. Supreme Court for nearly 25 years. Today in American academia, Brandeis's reputation still stands strong 80 plus years after his passing in 1941. It's almost as if people have been deliberately kept from looking deeper into the man. Brandeis remains a respected and revered beacon of modern social justice movements, and Brandeis University stands today as an institution to Brandeis's radical progressive ideals. when a critical analysis of Brandeis is honestly undertaken, this humanitarian man of the people quickly becomes a contrived and disingenuous cover story for a man with many faces, who is only now being burdened with the appropriate historical weight earned from such a prolonged and prolific career of anti-constitutional, anti-American radical social reform. So Brandeis University was the first to ban pro-Palestinian protests. And we see now, months after that, what the result was anti-Semitic laws being passed, and Trump is doing that through executive order. He's already done it. So we can see that the dialectic there, this problem, reaction, solution, this Hegelian sort of look, has now produced what they wanted. You know, it's getting harder and harder to criticize Israeli foreign policy or even just a Jew in particular. So one thing we must remember here is that there are 77 branches of Semitic-speaking people in the Near and Far East region. So when a Hebrew or a Jew or Israel claims anti-Semitism, they're actually staking claim to the whole tree of Semitic-speaking people. And the largest population of Semitic-speaking people is the Arab. 500 million Arabs are also Semites. So there's a giant contradiction in whenever they call somebody an anti-Semite, because it's actually Israel that could, be called the anti-Semite. More rightly, for sure. If you wanted to go on numbers, which they didn't want to, we will get into. They didn't want to argue the right to a Jewish homeland or who was going to get Palestine on numbers because they knew they would lose. I mean, there's 10 million Hebrews there now compared to 500 million Arabs. There's 77 branches of Semitic-speaking people. Yet, when anybody is critical of Israel, they are called an anti-Semite. Which means while Israel is attempting to remove the Arab physically from the geography, they're also at the same time attempting to remove them from the very definition of what it means to be a Semite. Now that's powerful to know that. That's a silver bullet to one of their most successful arguments or claims or tropes, right? Anti-Semite, oh yeah, there's 77 branches. Which one are you talking about? Immediately you wrestle back the intellectual and moral high ground from these people. This is why it's important. You leave them dumbfounded when you tell them that, because this is the first time they've ever heard it. This is what got me kicked off the farm twice and removed by police escort. Because I said Israel was created in 1917, not 1948, by the first U.S. Supreme Court, or the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court justice. That was it. That was the end of my time at the farm. From then on, I had to sneak on. What do you want from me? So where am I? I'm going off on tangents. So Brandeis, architect of the new freedom, finally. How many ever minutes we are in. I hope you are having a good time. My recommendation would be to settle in. Use these as something you can listen to in the background while you're doing other things. Or, ideally, you sit down and watch along with us, check the sources, immerse yourself in this, put the effort into figuring out what I'm saying, what we're telling you, because history is repeating over and over and over throughout the 20th century. And it's the same thing. Go figure. It's the people telling you all the nice sounding words that are the ones screwing you behind closed doors. But this is the progressive trick that we talk about. So at the end of August, Wilson sought one contributor in particular, not for his money. Wilson needed somebody to sharpen his message. He wanted to discuss the issue with the most incisive mind on the subject. Fortunately, that man had already expressed an interest in his campaign, though when he shuttled from Boston to New York by night boat, August 27th, Louis D. Brandeis could not have known that he, as much as anybody, would shape the future of Woodrow Wilson's campaign and career. Citation number 6. So Brandeis was thought of by Wilson as his obvious pick for Attorney General or Secretary of Commerce. Wilson telling Rabbi Stephen Weiss he, quote, needed Brandeis everywhere. end quote. Brandeis is today touted as the very, quote, architect of the new freedom, end quote. We'll show you multiple sources. Wilson's 1912 progressive platform is this architect of the new freedom. So we argue when Brandeis traveled to meet the president, he had already formulated his progressive plan and knew exactly what he was doing. From that initial introductory meeting at Seagirt, Wilson leaned heavily on the expertise of Brandeis, quote, whose opinions on economic questions he respected above all others, end quote. Now, this is, I think what did I say? August. So this is months before Wilson's election, right? Elections in November, August. We're in late August, so really September, October, November. We're looking at really 2 months before Wilson's elected. Here comes Brandeis. And his party was in disarray, and Brandeis straightened it all out. So Brandeis, because Brandeis understood the problem thoroughly, because he was ready with a definite plan for the bridling of monopoly, he became the chief architect of the new freedom. Page 110, Profits of Regulation, Thomas K. McCraw. And I believe I've shown this before, but I just want to show you again that we have the physical books. We're not just going off the internet. On August 28th, 1912, Louis D. Brandeis, the nationally known Boston attorney, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic presidential nominee, then serving as New Jersey governor, met secretly over lunch in Seagirt, New Jersey, the coastal town where the governor summered. So that's where we get that from. Louis D. Brandeis, the chief architect of the new freedom. Here is the book I just showed you that I have beside me, Woodrow Wilson and the Progressive Era. That actual book. Not that actual book, but that actual printing, if you get me. So there's another source here, Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, from Brandeis to Kagan. And guess who Kagan is, by the way, married to? PNAC, progressive extension of Brandeis, the ominous continuity of progressivism. So the centerpieces of this new freedom were the creation of the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve Board. The Fed, a centralized banking scheme independent of the government based on lending money at interest that has led to a collective debt so large and crippling as to render an entire nation paralyzed by a forever expanding debt clock. So we all know these things. Tough to deny any of that. The Federal Trade Commission, a regulatory institution, also free from the government, by the way, independent, based on protecting the consumer, that has since its benevolent inception expanded into a vast network of surveillance and monitoring well beyond its original publicly stated intentions. Big surprise. This is what they do. The many committees, commissions, and councils created by Brandeis during Wilson's first term, representing the actual manifestation into reality of Lippmann's proposed intelligence bureaus. This is an essential part of the story in that Brandeis, Lippmann, and the progressive construct, the administrative state, inspired by Graham Wallace's futuristic utopian, The Great Society, and Sidney Webb's scientifically governed industrial democracy. There's the actual dates, 1896 and 1902 are the two publishings. The Great Society is one of those books that were published in 1913, 1914. Through the founding of these regulatory agencies led by Brandeis, we see the very first glimpses into the superstructure of the administrative state 4 presidents before FDR's New Deal. So, quote, for Attorney General Wilson first thought of Louis D. Brandeis, the chief architect of the new freedom, end quote. Quote, Wilson had intended his Secretary of Commerce to be one of America's staunchest progressives, his advisor Louis D. Brandeis. Earliest mention of his name, however, incited considerable protest. Politicians, businessmen, and attorneys denounced him as a radical, a reckless meddler. Quote, the new freedom called for a new Declaration of Independence, end quote. So that should show you sort of the scope of the game plan. And this is exactly what they do. They go into the U.S. Constitution and completely experiment on all of it. This is the terminology that they use even. This is why there were so many Americans upset at him. They were going to attach the new living moving law, because society is always moving forward. They're going to have a law that moves with it. And that gets you off of the foundations of the U.S. Constitution, religion, and all of our other moorings and anchors that keep us grounded through tradition and value. So, quote, we all know Louis Brandeis is one of the most influential justices on the Supreme Court, but fewer of you may know that he was also the person who conceived the Federal Trade Commission, end quote. So Julie Brill, Commissioner, United States Federal Trade Commission. From her speech, Privacy from the Woods to the Weeds, September 15th, 2011. It was an address before the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Brill served as the commissioner of the FTC from 2010 to 2016 and is now Chief Privacy Officer and Corporate Vice President for Global Privacy, Safety, and Regulatory Affairs at Microsoft. So Brill fits the pattern of everyone else in this story. After graduating magna cum laude with a BA in economics from Ivy League, she then goes back and forth between public duty as commissioner of the FTC and Chief Privacy Officer at Microsoft. Here, Brill exhibiting a conflict of interest through public-private partnerships made commonplace during Brandeis' time. And what is that really but fascism? This is what Mussolini called corporatism. This relationship between the public government, public, and private enterprise, private corporations. This is why 1917 is the entrance of fascism into America, because they commandeer the factories. And it's only through a combination of the mining corporations and the steel corporations and the US government that it actually happens. And the chairman of the War Industries Board is Bernard Baruch, and we talked about him yesterday. He's the lone wolf of Wall Street. He's also Phi Beta Kappa and a close friend of Brandeis, Lippmann, and all these other progressives. So, quote, after Woodrow Wilson won the 1912 election, he asked Brandeis to recommend specifically how to solve the problem of the trusts. Brandeis conceived the Federal Trade Commission, which at Brandeis's urging, Congress empowered to investigate and prohibit unfair methods of competition with a, quote, broad and flexible mandate, wide-ranging powers, and the ability at its best to respond to the needs of changing times, end quote. So really no defining characteristics as to how broad and how far its reach can be. And it's going to be an answer to changing times. So we see, the imposition of progress in this always turning wheel. So the proper, quote, the proper role of the government is to encourage not combination, but cooperation. That's, end quote, Louis D. Brandeis to Richard Crane, November 11th. That's a private diary or letter. Letters of Louis Brandeis, page 511, 512. So, quote, a solicitor general once told the lawyer George Farnham that when Brandeis writes an opinion dealing with a question of federal practice, the law is settled for 50 years to come. While this may be somewhat exaggerated, Brandeis did have a great impact not only on jurisdictional matters, but on commercial law, antitrust, administrative law, utility regulation, federalism, and individual liberties, end quote. So, quote, the Federal Trade Commission is the brainchild of Louis D. Brandeis, end quote. Page 1, Privacy from the Woods to the Weeds, FTC Commissioner Julie Brill. She says it again, this time using the word brainchild. So, quote, when the FTC opened its doors in March 1915, it had become the surprising centerpiece of Wilson's antitrust program. During the 1912 campaign, Theodore Roosevelt had been the advocate for a strong commission. Roosevelt, who launched a short-lived progressive party, would even have allowed an agency to set prices. Wilson was skeptical of a commission in 1912 and remained skeptical when he launched his antitrust initiative in January 1914. He proposed a purely investigatory body, but when the initiative bogged down, he was persuaded by Louis Brandeis and George Rubley, a friend to Brandeis and a former Roosevelt advisor, to embrace part of the progressive program. Section 5's administratively enforced prohibition of unfair methods of competition. You can see that they're leaning heavily on Brandeis and this George Rubley character. And the first term of Wilson, 1912 to 1916, is really about establishing a domestic policy, building America into a place that fits with this new international model that's coming along. So the first 4 years is to establish this mechanism, and then the final 4 years is really to establish the international model that it is going to be attached to and be the leader of. This is what made the 20th century America's century and what rose America to dominance. So as a presidential advisor, Brandeis convinced the president, Congress, the Supreme Court, and the American people to accept radical new approaches to everything from labor legislation and trade unionism to savings bank life insurance, from antitrust laws to surveillance, from women's suffrage to conservation, from espionage and privacy law to taxation. Brandeis introducing to America new terms like scientific management, collective bargaining, regulated competition, industrial relations, standard cost accounting, trade agreement monitoring, resale price maintenance, interlocking directorates, and so on. So all of these things that we've heard before that are sort of normal in our lives in the year 2025, they're just being invented then, a lot of it by Brandeis. So Brandeis, more than anyone else, is responsible for placing the first foundational building blocks of our modern surveillance state through his introduction of a vast network of regulatory bureaucratic agencies. In 2015, DARPA named their domestic surveillance program after Brandeis. As attorney, Brandeis established a radical new method of arguing law, and once confirmed, Justice Brandeis transferred his method to the Supreme Court, making even our Supreme Court justices social activists. He opened the door to an entirely new interpretation of U.S. law through sociological jurisprudence. This is what I'm earlier talking about. And really what it did was made the judge himself just sort of a witness to the proceedings. He, too, became a slave to the scientific expert. Weirdest looking one there is Brandeis. So Brandeis, in the famous trust-busting investigations initiated on August 27, 1912, helped further establish Brandeis's reputation as the people's attorney and allowed him to expand on his idea of regulatory competition, something most assuredly discussed at Seagirt that same day. In fact, the date's significant here in that Brandeis meets Wilson for the first time on the very same day the Commission on Industrial Relations, the Walsh Commission, began its investigation into industrial working conditions. This really the opportunity to initiate federally a method bringing together the employer and the employee through the creation of industrial relations, scientific management, a perfecting of the manufacturing processes that organized labor stood in solidarity against. This is what scientific management is, and that's part two, Brandeis part two, scientific management. So we'll leave it at that. We're going to get into more detail there. So in the end, the investigation did little to curb monopolization, yet set in place a framework for labor still dominant in our world today. It's the worker, it's the laborer that did not appreciate being scientifically managed, as you can imagine. And so the trade union is established much like the plantation. And the trade union, for many of you union lovers out there, is actually the scientific expert entering wedge, getting between you and your power of labor. Because it's far easier for somebody to influence, persuade, or manipulate a board than it is the millions of workers. So this is, the manufacturer, capital, the owners of these the factories, they wanted trade unionism just as much as Brandeis wanted to set it as precedent. There was wars fought over all of this. Even as late as 1914, the most famous, the Ludlow Massacre. This is where Rockefeller sent the National Guard out, and they fired upon mining workers, their wives, and their children, set their whole camp on fire, killed a bunch of people. So as a mediator in the creation of labor law, Brandeis combined scientific management with industrial relations in bringing together employer and employee. Brandeis surrounding himself with key members of the Taylor Society and directing the nascent moments of our modern day industrial democracy. Brandeis here displaying a pattern we see repeated in each of the stories to follow by gaining influence over and then becoming the guiding hand to a newly discovered technology and the small but very influential group of men that created it. So Brandeis radically altered the old traditional definitions of American life in ways we are only now coming to terms with. The whole progressive era is established on Herbert Crowley's book, another guy living at the House of Truth and the founder of the New Republic. And that book was called The Promise of American Life. So it's a new promise being made there in 1912 that nobody else is really privy to. It's been going on for over 100 years now. So, quote, Louis Brandeis conceptualized regulated competition and introduced it into public debate. Political entrepreneurs in Congress enacted many of Brandeis's proposals into law, end quote. So Brandeis formulated a blueprint for a Federal Trade Commission from his experience with railroad regulation. This is where he made scientific management famous. I've shared recently about this, that he made headlines across America stating that he could save the railway, the New Haven Railway, $1 million a day by being more efficient. And so we saw it repeated with Elon Musk with his chainsaw. Except he's taking down the administrative state, something that Brandeis built. So what's happening here is, they're going to tear all this administrative brick and mortar, the physicalness of it all, but it's just going digital. And so I'd be very hesitant before starting to support or cheer for anything that's going on under Trump, Musk, FDR Jr. That's all hopium. I mean, FDR Jr. is compromised by the very same people that killed his father and his uncle. And it's going to require different thinking that got us into this to get out. And this trick has tricked the past 4 generations of people. And it's about to trick this one again. So nobody out there think that they're smarter than anybody else because of generations. It's fooling you just the same as it's fooling grandpa. The only ones showing it is bulletproofpub.com. What is that worth to you? So, quote, when Woodrow Wilson, as Theodore Roosevelt had done, was looking to promote his agenda on the Council of Brandeis, he opted for commissions. Commissions had the power and the merit of regulating industry and avoiding the need for direct legislative intervention. End quote. So, quote, Brandeis decomposed scientific management and 19th century common law and recombined their parts in a syncretic blueprint for a Federal Trade Commission, page 20, Brandeis and the Making of Regulated Competition. So, quote, insofar as the career of a single person illustrates both the problems that led to the FTC's creation and the reasons for its subsequent failure, that person is Louis D. Brandeis, the most influential critic of trust during his generation. Brandeis served from 1912 until 1916 as Woodrow Wilson's chief economic advisor and was regarded as one of the architects of the FTC, profits of regulation. And I include the pages here with the quotes. Now, these are from internetarchive.org. So any book that is out of print that's important is generally there. I've been rarely disappointed. Okay, so this is the story of Brandeis, him influencing President Wilson, creating the Federal Reserve, usury, speculation, lending money at interest, usury, really a very caustic influence on America. Independent of the government. This is what's created this never-ending debt clock. So here's the sources. I encourage you guys to go and check this out. And I think we'll just leave it at that. Any other questions you have, leave it in the comment section on the YouTube site, and come find me on Facebook, Diego Garcia. And we're the history of propaganda on YouTube. Okay, everybody. Till next time.